It's a quote that sits at the crossroads of belief and identity, and maybe that's why it feels so relevant when we talk about people who walk away from religion, especially when the people who leave aren't bitter or hostile or rebellious, but gentle, generous, and often quietly heartbroken. It surprises some, maybe even confuses others, when people known for their compassion and warmth let go of faith. After all, kindness is often thought of as something religion nurtures, so when deeply kind people choose to step away, it challenges the assumption that goodness is tied to belief. But that's where the misunderstanding begins, because for many of these people, it's exactly their kindness that led them out. Not in a reactionary way, not as a rebellion, but as a consequence of living their values too honestly to ignore the contradictions they saw. Over time, these contradictions start to pile up. A faith that speaks about love but draws lines around who deserves it. A doctrine that praises humility while asking for unquestioning submission. Institutions that preach forgiveness while punishing doubt. For someone with a sensitive conscience, those contradictions aren't just abstract, they're painful. And kindness, real kindness, doesn't always thrive in systems that rely on boundaries, hierarchy, or dogma. Systems that say, love thy neighbor, but only if they fit the mold. So it's not that kind people are immune to faith. In fact, many are drawn to it because it promises community, purpose, and moral grounding. But at some point, for some, the gaps between the promises and the reality grow too wide. They see injustice overlooked by religious leaders, abuses brushed aside in the name of tradition, whole groups of people marginalized, and somehow it's always God's will. When you're someone who truly cares about others, not just those who share your beliefs, that starts to feel like a moral betrayal. And that tension doesn't go away just because you pray more. In fact, it can make prayer feel hollow, like you're asking for peace from a system that helped create the conflict in the first place. Many who leave didn't set out to reject religion. They started with questions, quiet ones, internal ones, the kind of questions that religious environments often treat as threats rather than signs of growth. And so kindness, paired with intellectual honesty, becomes a risk, a dangerous mix in rigid systems. Not because kindness is wrong, but because it won't sit quietly when it sees harm. It won't pretend all is well when people are suffering in silence just to protect the image of the institution. This is especially true in religious communities, where doubt is seen as weakness and conformity is rewarded more than compassion, where obedience is praised but empathy is controlled. In those environments, a kind person can start to feel alone, not because they've done anything wrong, but because their heart is pulling them somewhere their faith says they shouldn't go. Take someone who grows up being taught that certain people, gay people for instance, are living in sin, and yet when they actually meet these people, talk to them, work with them, become friends with them, the dogma doesn't hold. The stereotype unravels. What's left is the uncomfortable realization that they were taught to withhold love under the illusion of righteousness. And if they're kind, truly kind, that realization doesn't fade. It gnaws at them. They start to see the cost of selective compassion, how it breaks families apart, fuels shame, and pushes good people into hiding. And slowly, quietly, a shift begins. A shift from following the rules to following their conscience. That doesn't always mean an instant rejection of faith. Sometimes it's years of trying to make it work, of finding loopholes in doctrine, of looking for more progressive interpretations. But eventually, the weight becomes too much. The excuses wear thin, and the person who once sat in the front pew finds themselves standing at the edge, unsure where they belong. Kindness doesn't disappear when they leave. If anything, it expands, because now it's no longer limited by who fits a sacred text or aligns with a particular worldview. Now, their empathy isn't filtered through a theological lens. It's allowed to be direct, human, and unrestricted. They might not call it spiritual, but the way they move through the world, with respect, with humility, with a deep concern for others, speaks louder than creeds ever could. And this isn't some fringe story. Studies show that among people who disaffiliate from religion, a growing number cite moral and ethical concerns as a major reason. Not selfishness, not nihilism, but the inability to reconcile their values with the actions and positions of their religious institutions. In 2021, Pew Research found that a large portion of the religiously unaffiliated, especially those who left organized religion, did so because they viewed religious groups as too judgmental, too hypocritical, or too focused on power and politics. That isn't a rejection of goodness. It's a rejection of systems that claim moral authority while doing real harm. The people who leave aren't abandoning morality. They're often refining it. They're removing the parts that felt transactional, tribal, or fear-based, and holding on to the parts that actually help people. That's not an easy transition. In many communities, leaving faith isn't just a spiritual decision, it's social, cultural, sometimes even economic. You can lose family, friends, and belonging. And yet some of the kindest people make that leap, not because they stopped caring, but because they cared too much to keep pretending. They couldn't keep defending a belief system that treated women as second class, or dismissed mental health struggles as a lack of faith, or viewed tragedy as divine punishment. Their compassion outgrew their doctrine, their conscience outpaced their creed. And when that happens, staying starts to feel like complicity. They'd rather risk being misunderstood than continue endorsing something that no longer aligns with what they know in their gut to be true. Some stay quiet about their shift, not because they're unsure, but because they've seen how easily kindness can be weaponized against them. How could you leave something that gave you so much? They're asked. Or worse, how could you abandon the truth? But truth to them no longer means clinging to an idea out of fear. It means being honest, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it costs them the comfort of certainty. They don't want to hurt anyone. In fact, many go out of their way to reassure their religious friends and family that they're still the same person, still kind, still thoughtful, still here. But the reaction is often disappointment, suspicion, or even pity, as if letting go of belief automatically means letting go of depth or meaning or morality. It doesn't. In fact, many find that stepping away from religion gives them more space to live out their values, not less. There's no longer a tension between what they're told to believe and what they actually feel. They're no longer constantly trying to reconcile the teachings with their lived experience. Instead of filtering every act of kindness through a belief system, they can just be kind. No agenda, no eternal reward, no fear of punishment. For some, that's the first time kindness has felt truly free. It's also the first time doubt has felt like a strength instead of a sin. Because doubt, handled honestly, often leads to deeper understanding. It forces you to re-examine your assumptions, question authority, and actually take responsibility for your choices. In religious settings, that kind of thinking can be seen as dangerous, but outside those boundaries, it's liberating. That doesn't mean these people don't still struggle with meaning or purpose. Everyone does. But now, they build their meaning themselves, grounded in relationships, curiosity, art, science, and lived experience. And in that process, many find that their sense of wonder doesn't disappear without religion, it expands. It becomes less about a divine plan and more about the incredible reality of existence itself. A sunset doesn't need to be proof of a creator to be beautiful. A human connection doesn't need to be sacred to be profound. Suffering doesn't need a metaphysical explanation to matter. It just does. Some say that without religion, people lose their moral compass. But for the people we're talking about, the ones who leave not in anger but in sorrow with their kindness intact, morality doesn't vanish. It matures. It becomes less about obeying rules and more about asking better questions. Who is harmed? Who is helped? What actually improves life for others? What do justice and dignity look like in practice, not just in theory? These aren't easy questions, but they're real ones. And unlike dogma, they don't come with guaranteed answers. They require you to stay alert, stay thoughtful, and most of all, stay humble. Ironically, that humility is something many of these people didn't feel they could express within religion. They were told to have faith, to be confident in the truth, even when their conscience said otherwise. Once they step away, humility stops being a threat to belief and starts becoming the foundation of their ethics. That shift can be subtle, but it's powerful. It's no longer about being right, it's about doing right. Even when no one's watching, even when there's no promise of eternal reward, even when it's hard. That kind of morality, uncoerced, unsupervised, and self-chosen, is often more stable than the kind based on divine command. Because it doesn't depend on what a particular scripture says or what a certain leader interprets. It depends on real human experience. What causes harm? What creates connection? What helps us live together with respect and honesty? These are the kinds of questions that often lead the kindest people out of religion, not because they're running from accountability, but because they want it to mean something deeper than obedience. In fact, many of them look back and realize that their kindness always came from something deeper than belief. It came from their temperament, their empathy, their life experience. Religion may have shaped how they expressed that kindness, but it didn't invent it, and it certainly didn't own it. So, when the doctrines started conflicting with that inner compass, something had to give. And often it was the doctrine. They couldn't keep defending texts that spoke of stoning and slavery as if those were just historical context. They couldn't keep endorsing leaders who protected power over people. They couldn't keep pretending that their doubts were just temptations instead of legitimate concerns. And in the end, they realized something essential. Being kind isn't about what you believe, it's about how you treat others, especially when no one's telling you what to do. Some find new communities outside of religion, ethical societies, volunteer groups, friendships built on shared values rather than shared theology. Others go it alone for a while, not because they want to be isolated, but because rebuilding trust after religious loss takes time, especially if that religion once promised all the answers. But the kindness stays, sometimes even grows. They become more patient with other people's pain, more open to stories that don't match their own, less interested in labeling, and more interested in understanding. And what's most striking is how often they carry a quiet grace, not in the religious sense, but in the human sense. A kind of calm strength that says, I've questioned everything I was taught, and I'm still here. Still trying to do good, still listening, still learning. That's not a failure of faith. That's a victory of integrity. Of course, not everyone sees it that way. There are still those who frame leaving religion as a collapse of morality or as selfishness disguised as self-discovery. But that narrative doesn't hold up when you actually look at the lives of the people who left. Many of them are more active in their communities now than they ever were before. They donate, they volunteer, they advocate, not out of obligation, but out of a genuine sense of solidarity with other people. And that shift from obligation to authenticity matters. It's one thing to be told you should love others. It's another to realize, all on your own, that you want to. That compassion doesn't need to be commanded, it can be chosen. And when it's chosen freely, it's often deeper, more durable, and more honest. That's one reason why when you ask these people what they miss about religion, the answer is rarely the rules. It's the community. The shared rituals, the music, the gatherings, the feeling of being part of something bigger. But those things, connection, beauty, transcendence, aren't owned by religion. They're human. And part of what makes leaving faith so painful for some isn't the loss of belief, but the loss of those structures that once held their kindness in a shared space. The kindest people who leave religion don't usually throw everything out. They hold on to what's still true for them. They may keep the songs, the quiet moments, the reverence, but they let go of what doesn't match their values anymore. And that process of filtering out the harmful and holding on to the good takes emotional maturity. It's not done impulsively. It's done with care, sometimes grief. Because for many, religion wasn't just belief. It was family. It was tradition. It was memory. Letting go of that feels like losing part of yourself. But over time, that space gets filled again with a new kind of meaning. Not handed down, but built. Not inherited, but earned. It's in the conversations they now feel free to have, the friends they no longer have to censor themselves around, the life decisions that no longer have to fit a narrow mold. It's in the honesty of knowing they don't have all the answers and being okay with that. And that's another thing often overlooked. For all the criticism they face, many of the kindest explorers are more comfortable with uncertainty than the religious people they left behind. They're okay not knowing exactly what happens after death. They're okay living without guarantees, because what they care about isn't controlling the unknown. It's making the known world more just, more humane, more beautiful. They don't need a divine reason to help someone. They help because they see suffering and feel compelled to act. They don't need a sacred text to tell them that love matters. They already know it does. And yes, some people will still say they've lost their way. But if you follow their lives, the evidence points elsewhere. You'll see them taking care of aging parents even when it's hard. You'll see them standing up for people who've been marginalized. You'll see them listening more than they speak, questioning more than they judge. That's not moral decay. That's ethical evolution. It's what happens when someone chooses kindness without needing permission. When they live with integrity, not because they're told to, but because they believe it matters. And in some ways, that's harder. It means taking full responsibility. There's no eternal judge handing out rewards, no divine punishment to keep you in line, just you, your choices, and the impact they have. That kind of freedom scares some people, but for others, it's the beginning of real moral agency. And once you've tasted that, once you've lived out your values without fear, it's hard to go back. You realize you don't need to believe in a higher power to live by higher principles. That kindness can be rooted in empathy, not obedience. That goodness doesn't require faith, just courage, reflection, and care. That's why, even if they don't talk about it much, these people stand as quiet evidence that morality isn't owned by religion. They remind us that some of the deepest compassion grows in places where faith once stood and where critical thinking now flourishes. Their stories matter, not because they prove religion wrong, but because they prove something else. That people are capable of choosing love, justice, and empathy, even when it's hard, even when it costs them, even when it means stepping away from the only worldview they've ever known. And maybe that's the real strength behind their kindness. It's not shaped by fear or loyalty or eternal consequences. It's shaped by the simple, often difficult human decision to care anyway. Of course, not every story ends with clarity. Some wrestle with guilt for years, unsure if they did the right thing. Some drift in and out of belief, rebuilding and questioning again and again. Others find peace almost immediately, not because the answers are easy, but because they've stopped pretending to believe what they don't. But in all of those stories, there's something that runs deeper than certainty, and that's the quiet decision to be honest. To say out loud or just to themselves, I don't know, I don't believe this, I can't keep going along with something that no longer feels true. That kind of honesty can be unsettling, especially in religious settings where doubt is framed as weakness or even sin. But for many kind people, it's not rebellion. It's alignment. It's making their outer lives match their inner lives. They're not trying to destroy anyone's faith. They're just trying to stop betraying themselves. And in that space, the space where belief used to live, something else takes root. Something not built on dogma, but on depth. Not on authority, but on awareness. They learn to sit with tension, to hold space for other people's experiences even when they don't match their own. To ask better questions and to be okay when there are no easy answers. That's not a loss of purpose, that's the beginning of wisdom. And maybe that's what some people don't understand, that when kind people leave religion, they're not walking away from meaning, they're walking toward a different kind of meaning, one that's harder to define, but often more grounded. They stop separating the sacred from the ordinary and start seeing beauty in both. A conversation becomes sacred, a moment of silence, a shared meal, a hard truth spoken gently. They no longer need scripture to feel reverence. They feel it in a hospital room, in a long hug, in a child's curiosity, in a stranger's kindness. They're not waiting for heaven, they're paying attention here. And here, in this life, in this world, they often become exactly the kind of person religion says it wants to produce. Thoughtful, compassionate, ethical, courageous, but without the need to believe they're being watched, judged, or measured. They do good, because good needs to be done. And that shift from faith-based virtue to freestanding virtue is something we should pay attention to, especially in a time when religious affiliation is declining and more people are asking, what comes next? What comes next is already here. It's being lived out by the people who walked away quietly but with clarity, the ones who stopped believing in a God but never stopped believing in people. They're raising families without doctrine but with deep care. They're helping their neighbors not because they were told to, but because they see themselves in others. They're living ethical lives, full lives, meaningful lives, without needing metaphysical permission. And that might not fit the old narratives about religion being the source of all goodness, but it's becoming harder to deny. The data supports it. The lived experiences confirm it, and the people themselves, the ones who left, not out of resentment, but out of reflection, show it every day in how they live. It's not always easy. They still face judgment, they still face loss, they still navigate the weight of leaving behind something that once defined them. But what they gain, authenticity, autonomy, clarity, is worth it. And maybe that's the real reason some of the kindest people leave religion. Not because they're less committed to doing good, but because they want to do it with both eyes open, no conditions, no caveats, just the honest human choice to be decent in a complicated world. No divine command needed, just the willingness to show up with integrity, with kindness, and with the courage to live by their own hard-earned convictions, even if it means walking alone.